time. Hope you're ready to hear this shit. Yo, I've lived through shit you would never imagine, man. I'm finally here. I finally got my chance to prove myself. You're about to hear some shit you'll never hear again in your entire life. Okay. So the Bay of Pigs was in 1961. It was an invasion. It was the Bay of Pigs invasion, but you can call it the Bay of Pigs as just like a shorten it, you know. So basically, what happened was it was on the April 17th. It was from April 17th to April 20th. Excuse me. So essentially, I have my notes here. I'm sorry if that's, I can't off the cuff is a little difficult. So it was a failed landing operation on the southwestern coast of Cuba in 1961 by Cuban exiles who opposed Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution. So really what it was, and he said it was covertly financed and directed by the U.S. government. So what we're talking about here is people who were part of Fidel Castro's revolution, who were, in support of it. And then because of the exile of President Carlos Prio, they decided to rise up, and the United States government decided to fund it, because that seemed like the best option, because you have the strength of people who used to be fighting a war and then decided not to, or rather, didn't decide not to, but had some sort of anger about it. So that was the idea. So it says here that Dwight D. Eisenhower, I mean, it's in the middle initial, it's not, I thought it, for like 100% accuracy, I thought I'd throw it in. He allocated $13.1 million to the CIA, sorry about that, my computer sort of, in March of 1960 to use against Castro. So that was part of it. And then he used... so using Cuban counter-revolutionaries, the CIA proceeded to organize invasion operation. So the idea was that they would use people who may have information. That could be part of it. So it says after Castro's victory, Cuban exiles, who had traveled to the U.S., formed a counter-revolutionary military unit, Brigade 2506. So these were people who were part of the revolution. Like I said, people who were part of the revolution. They were exiled, and then they formed a counter-revolutionary, which would, so that would be countering the effects of a revolution. And so the purpose was to overthrow, the thing, what's important to remember here is that it may have been because of the increasing laws that were being put forth, because it says it was an increasingly communist government, and it's not necessarily a shot at the the idea of equal distribution of things like land or wealth, but just on the strength of history, it is true that there have been a lot of cases in which maybe the government, or a government rather, run on the strength of communism, doesn't always work out. So there's that. And so it may have been certain, certain things that some of his soldiers had said. Soldiers, people working for him. I don't know why I said soldiers. Actually, that works. Sorry, I think I mixed it up with another word in my head. So yeah, so it says over 1,400, 1,400, wherever you're from, paramilitaries divided into 5 infantry battalions and 1 paratrooper battalion. So, just spreading it out. They assembled a launch from Guatemala and Nicaragua by boat on the 17th of April in 1961. It says 2 days earlier, 8 CIA-supplied B-26 bombers had attacked Cuban airfields and then returned to the U.S. on the night of 17th of April. So, God knows if this is a warning. I'm just going to set this here. I have multiple notes because it's important. So, sorry, they're connected. So on the night of April 17th, the main invasion force landed on the beach at Playa Giron. I don't know if I'm saying that right or wrong. I apologize. I'm not, like I said, I'm not very. So in the Bay of Pigs, where it overwhelmed the local revolutionary militia. So it wasn't an open and shut case. It wasn't it wasn't just death on arrival. There was an attempt made, and it continued. It didn't go all the way through though. So there was definitely some, So initially, yeah. Excuse me. So it says here that Jose Ramon Fernandez led the Cuban army counteroffensive. Later, Castro took personal control. So, this is, I think maybe, and it's hard to tell, but there's a possibility Castro may have had information about the details of why, or the details of who was part of the militias. I think it said, the paratroopers and infantry battalions that were attacking Cuba. Maybe the airfield attack sort of felt like a personal shot, like maybe it was, who knows. But he took over. And so yeah, it says, as the invaders lost strategic initiative, the international community found out about the invasion, and U.S. President John F. Kennedy decided to withhold further air support. Which, it's hard to tell if that was a good or bad decision. I don't really have an opinion on it. Either way, it was certainly a decision that was made. Excuse me. So, the plan devised during Eisenhower's presidency and had required involvement of both air and naval forces. So obviously there was a lot being thrown at this, hence the $13.1 million that he was actually putting into it. So it says, without air support, the invasion was being conducted with only one half of the forces that the CIA had deemed necessary. So, obviously, there were holes in this plan. There were holes in the plan. There were flaws. The invading force had been defeated within 3 days by Castro and the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces. So, clearly, along with the fact that I think it's hard to... There were definitely some decisions made by the U.S. government that may not have been the best. Maybe it wasn't the best idea to bring in people, or rather to bring in specifically people who were part of the Cuban Revolution and then left because of an increasingly communist, set of rules or laws. It might have been better to add them to normal U.S. militias. I can't speak on the improvement. Let's see. The invasion was it was a foreign policy failure. And it says also the invasion's defeat solidified Castro's role as a national hero and widened the political divide between the two formerly allied countries. So, and it says it also pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, and those strengthened Soviet-Cuban relations would lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So, obviously, the Bay of Pigs was not... I think on paper, it seemed like a good decision. But the way it was handled was not at the same level of quality. Yeah. What's important to remember here, though, I'm just gonna bring up some background. Um, uh, sorry, thought of a joke. Something somebody said earlier. Uh, so so the Cuban Revolution, I think, had been happening for a while, and when something like there were other, I want to say I was going to bring up the theory that any sort of revolution in a country when taking over, they're obviously not going to be very, there are cases, I'm sure there are cases in which a country was going to, sort of comply with the rules of any sort of country they were associating with. As in, maybe the state of the country they were in was so bad they just wanted out. I'm sure that's happened. Um, but you see it with America itself. America, you had colonists who wanted freedom from something like taxes and something as simple as tea. Um, Hence the Boston Tea Party. And so yeah, I think so, and obviously they wanted to make their own rules, and they did, and now we have America, um, but that's a whole other thing by itself. But this was one of those cases. This was, I mean, you can see clearly that there were tensions with the United States, and there's actually proof here. There's actually proof. Sorry. So it says, Castro's Cuban government ordered the country's oil refineries, then controlled by U.S. corporations Esso and Standard Oil and Anglo-Dutch Shell, to produce crude oil purchase from the Soviet Union, but under pressure from the U.S. government, these companies refused. Castro responded by expropriating the refineries and nationalizing them under state control. In retaliation, the U.S. canceled its import of Cuban sugar, provoking Castro to nationalize most U.S.-owned assets, including banks and sugar mills. Relations between Cuba and the U.S. were further strained following the explosion and sinking of a French vessel, the Découverte, I don't speak French, in Havana Harbor in March 1960. The cause of the explosion was never determined, but Castro publicly mentioned that the U.S. government were guilty of sabotage. On the 13th of October in 1960, the U.S. government then prohibited the majority of exports, sorry, I might have lost my place, to Cuba, the exceptions being medicines and certain foodstuffs, marking the start of an economic embargo. In retaliation, the Cuban National Institute for Agrarian Reform took control of 383 private-run businesses on the 14th of October, and on the 25th of October, a further 166 U.S. companies operating in Cuba had their premises seized and nationalized, including Coca-Cola and Sears Roebuck, which I don't think is as obviously as well known today. I could be wrong. I don't know. On the 16th of December, the U.S. then ended its important quota of Cuban sugar. The U.S. government was becoming increasingly critical. Sorry, I just need to make sure I have this right. I do. The U.S. government was becoming increasingly critical of Castro's revolutionary government. At an August 1960 meeting at the Organization of American States held in Costa Rica, the U.S. Secretary of State Christian Herter publicly proclaimed that Castro's administration was following faithfully the Bolshevik pattern by instituting a single-party political system, taking governmental control of trade unions, suppressing civil liberties, and removing both the freedom of speech and the freedom of press. He furthermore asserted that the international communism was using Cuba as an operational base for further spreading revolution in the Western Hemisphere, and called on other OAS members to condemn the Cuban Revolution for its breach of human rights. In turn, Castro lambasted the treatment of black people and the working classes he had witnessed in New York when he ridiculed as the super free, super democratic, super humane, super civilized city, claiming that the U.S. poor were living in the bowels of the imperialist monster. He attacked the mainstream U.S. media and accused of being controlled by big business. Superficially, the U.S. was trying to improve its relationship with Cuba. Several negotiations between representatives from Cuba and the U.S. took place around this time. Repairing international financial relations was the focal point of these discussions. Political relations were another hot topic of these conferences. The U.S. stated they would not interfere with Cuba's domestic affairs, but that the island should limit its ties with the Soviet Union. Sorry, 1 second, I got a text. So obviously, and I mean, the list goes on. Like, it's not just Cuba's problems with other problems they had. There were interjections from several places. But overall, it was a long time coming. The Bay of Pigs was not, you had a lot of issues between, the trading, and, clearly any sort of revolution that's developing ideals that don't match one of another country they're suspicious of, as soon as that country launches an invasion, not only against that revolution, but with, exiles from that revolution, that cuts the tie. And that really is what caused the Bay of Pigs. I mean, if we're being excuse me, if we're being honest, there was tension, and that tension between the U.S. and Cuba exploded and caused an invasion that failed, and later caused a lot of tension and danger to a lot of countries, including the U.S., including Cuba. Russia got involved, but yeah, that would be the summary.
Oh, yeah. Don't tell me I'm not the hardest motherfucker. Don't tell me I'm not the hardest motherfucker on this planet. Some real hip-hop shit right there.